Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Armchair Philosophies podcast with your host, Peter. Now, this episode is basically a follow-up episode. In my last episode, I talked about some of the problems I had with left-wing anti-war takes on the war in Ukraine, and how I thought they were playing the geopolitical equivalent of 1D chess, and were way too eager to accept Russian pretext. So, I got a comment on that video, and after performing my best due diligence on this person, which was going on this person's profile and trying to suss out whether or not they were a Russian troll, I decided, based on some of the things this person had favorited, like Thunderfoot's old anti-feminist videos from 10 years ago or so, when the whole, feminism ruins everything videos were all the rage, that in spite of this person literally being named account 2525, that they probably were not a Russian troll. And some of the talking points this person brought up, and I'm going to assume it's a he, just based on their anti-Thunderfoot videos. Some of the talking points I've heard from other people, John Mearsheimer, to a certain extent, Peter Zion, although he's certainly not pro-Russia. And it's more common things that you hear in the debate surrounding the war in Ukraine. So in that sense, I thought it was worth talking about. So let me get into it. I'm going to post the entirety of the comment on the screen, and if you want, you can pause the video and read it, but I'm going to go over it point by point. So let me get into the comment. The comment says, "I haven't heard any credible claims that NATO was planning on invading Russia, and that's why Russia invaded." Now, my first response to that is I apologize. I had intended to post a link to the debate between Vaush and the TikTok guy whose name has already fled my brain, in which that person very much was attempting to argue that Russia was invading because NATO was planning on attacking Russia. And when Vaush tried to pin him down on this and say where you get this idea from, he was trying to say that Angela Merkel said it, and when Vaush wanted an article, where's your source for this? The source the guy brought up, Vaush reads it. Of course, that's not what Angela Merkel said. He calls him out on it, and then the guy basically starts, spewing words out of his mouth hole to run out the clock, change the conversation, dodge, that sort of thing. And it's one of those amusing moments in debates that it makes debates interesting when those sorts of events happen, when they have a complete screw-up like that. So there definitely are people who are claiming that NATO was planning to attack Ukraine. Some of them are obvious, they've just completely drunk the Russian Kool-Aid. The second part of this is that it's obviously the no true Scotsman fallacy. So he says, I haven't heard any credible person. And the word credible is doing a lot of work right there, because there certainly are people who are saying that. And to say, okay, well, those people aren't credible, that's a cop-out. No true Scotsman would claim that NATO was planning on invading Russia. That's basically what you're saying. But more than that, it brings me to a third point, is that I don't feel that's being entirely honest. And the reason I don't feel that's being entirely honest, it'll become clear as I continue with this comment. But although there may not be the explicit statement that NATO was planning to attack Russia, it is heavily implied, particularly in the speech that Putin gave right before launching the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The implications were as heavy as you can get. He laid it on thick. So I guess by that logic, if no credible person is saying that NATO was planning to attack Russia, and Vladimir Putin was all but stating that NATO was planning to attack Russia, then I guess by that logic, Vladimir Putin isn't credible, which I think, I'm willing to agree on that point. So continuing on to the person's comment, he says, the main arguments I hear for Russia invading are about Ukraine abusing ethnic Russians in Ukraine, which is a bit of a veneer for less moral reasons. I believe what you mean to say there is that it's complete bullshit. But personally, I'm looking forward to the day that France invades English-speaking Canada on behalf of the oppressed Quebecois minority. But, joking aside and continuing on with his statement, he says, NATO does want to militarily encircle Russia, and weaken its strategic position, which it has been doing since the early 90s, with former Soviet states joining NATO and compromising Russia's nuclear threat with anti-ballistic missile systems on its border. It's not because NATO is planning on invading Russia. It's because NATO wants to weaken Russia and make it less defensible and have less negotiating power. There is a massive indefensible border between Russia and Ukraine, and there is a history of European countries invading Russia through it. Warranted or not, that's the Russian perspective. All right, so what he did there was actually a concise summary of Vladimir Putin's main points when he made his speech about invading Ukraine. But I want to continue on because there's another part of this that I want to play off the first part that I just read. So he says, Ukraine joining NATO was a clear red line for Russia. CIA Director William Burns wrote about it. How would the U.S. act if China was allying itself with Canada and Mexico and placing anti-ballistic missile systems and short-range ballistic missiles near the U.S. border? How would the U.S. act if Russia placed nuclear weapons in Cuba? So to say again, the reason that I'm responding to this comment at all is because I've heard these talking points enough where it's worth responding to. This is basically Vladimir Putin vis-a-vis John Mearsheimer. Now, there's a few problems with this, and I did catch your reference to the Cuban Missile Crisis, by the way. But the first problem is that the analogy doesn't work because a better analogy would actually be, imagine if China was starting to have deals with countries in South America like Brazil, which it is, trying to wheel and deal in our backyard in Cuba and Brazil. And so the United States engaged in a preemptive war against Mexico, along with some other thrown in pretext about cartels or whatever, and tried to replace the government of Mexico because of what other countries in the region were doing. Do you see the problem there? Ukraine was not about to join NATO. There were not any NATO ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil. It was preemptive on the assumption that would one day happen. And this is, again, where I feel that the first part of this comment, where he says no credible person is claiming that NATO is going to attack Russia. If NATO is not going to attack Russia, then how can you even begin to justify a preemptive war on this basis? But beyond that, I think that this idea of geopolitics gets several things wrong. The first problem is that nations are not entitled to get what they want, even if it is in their strategic self-interest. First, because that's just not how geopolitics works. And secondly, because other nations have competing interests. So let's do a thought experiment, right? Let's say that there is a nation, let's call it the completely hypothetical state of Poland. And the completely hypothetical state of Poland has a neighbor. Let's call that the completely hypothetical state of Russia. Now, after centuries of abuse from their completely hypothetical state of Russia, the completely hypothetical state of Poland has the opportunity to join in an economic alliance with its neighbors that will benefit its economy, and a military alliance with its neighbors, and a superpower on the other side of the ocean that will defend it from its abusive neighbor, the completely hypothetical state of Russia. Of course, it is in the completely hypothetical state of Poland's self-interest to do that. Now, I'm being sarcastic here. Poland isn't a hypothetical country, and that is basically why it joined the EU and NATO. I think that Vladimir Putin is acting out of a sense of aggrieved entitlement that Russia is no longer as powerful as it was when it was the center of the Soviet Union. And I think that people like John Mearsheimer are overestimating the power of Russia, and they're treating Russia as special, that Russia is entitled to have its interests respected over and above the interests of its neighbors because reasons. But when you really stop and break down those reasons, and when you look at the reasons why so many of its neighbors turned away from Russia and towards the West, you realize the power imbalance when you attempt to compare it with something like the hypothetical of Canada or Mexico joining with China, right? So here's what would happen under that hypothetical. So China goes to Canada and Mexico, makes them an offer, wants to place troops and ballistic missile systems on the American border, and the president in the United States would call up the president of Mexico, the prime minister of Canada, and say, okay, here's our counteroffer. the status quo. And the Mexican president, the Canadian prime minister, they'd say, wow, that is way better than what China is offering us. We're going to tell China to stuff it. And that would be that. And it's not because the United States would have to threaten to use military force. It's because the trade relations and the economic relationships between the countries is more valuable to Mexico or Canada than whatever China would have to offer them. They would have no incentive to do that. It would not be in their self-interest. NAFTA and its successor treaty, for all the problems that it created in the United States, it created problems in Mexico as well. It was bad for a lot of people, but it was good for Mexico as a whole. It, to a certain extent, was good for the United States as a whole. It's just screwed over certain categories of people, like American factory workers or Mexican farmers. And the business and trade that Mexico does with the United States, under what are quite generous terms, is just more beneficial to Mexico than anything China would offer them. If they had security problems, if they needed military aid, the United States would, in all likelihood, be more than happy to provide it. So what could China actually offer them? So going back to Russia and the former Soviet Eastern Bloc countries, we have to bear in mind that every country that was a part of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc was economically retarded by their involvement with that system. Even today, 30 years on, if you look at Germany and you look at what had been East Germany and what had been West Germany is better off than what was once East Germany, even all this time later. So when you look at the other countries, like Poland, for example, certain countries that were part of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union aligned themselves fairly quickly with the European Union and with NATO, and certain countries did not. And you run the clock forward about 20 years, and people can look around and see that although all of the countries experienced some long-term economic stunting from being a part of the Soviet system, countries like Poland, which is Ukraine's neighbor, still were better off for having joined with the rest of Europe. And countries like Belarus and to a lesser extent Ukraine, which went back and forth of whether they'd move in the direction of Europe or stay close to Russia, they did not do as well as their neighbors who aligned themselves earlier with Europe. So the verdict was in, that the smart play was to join with the European Union. That was what was in their self-interest. In terms of joining NATO, well, considering the fact that Russia has a habit of attacking its neighbors, that also seems like a rather smart play. Now, what about Russia? Isn't it in Russia's interest to keep all of these states as satellite puppet states within its sphere of influence? That's another thing that the John Mearshheimers like to talk about, is sphere of influence. Well, here's the reality. They just didn't have the power to, because Russia went down a path that, although it made a certain oligarchical elite within the country wealthy and powerful, it didn't build long-term, durable, robust economic growth. What happened at the end of the Soviet Union is that you had all of these state-run companies, and they were basically sold off at fire sale prices. And the people who were able to take control of what had been these massive state-owned conglomerates became vastly wealthy. And when Vladimir Putin came to power, he basically made all of these people fall in line, started reabsorbing some of those companies and putting his cronies and friends in charge of a lot of these, what had been large state-owned companies, and enriching themselves. And the primary basis of the Russian economy had been extractive resources like oil, gas, and minerals. And they could still fall back on the hard power that Russia had during the Soviet days. And what tends to happen in these countries whose economies are based on resource extraction is that all of the money can be concentrated much more easily in the hands of an elite, while leaving much of the rest of the economy underdeveloped. And this meant that Russia had a kind of superficial economy when it came to dealing with the rest of its neighbors. and it meant that its soft power was practically non-existent. Beyond buying oil, gas, and raw materials from Russia, there wasn't a lot to be gained from aligning yourself with Russia in terms of the former Soviet, former Eastern Bloc countries. It just didn't have the necessary soft power to keep these countries in its orbit. And this, I think, pissed Vladimir Putin off. Again, there is a massive amount of aggrieved entitlement in Vladimir Putin's actions. In his mind, and apparently in the minds of people like John Mearsheimer, Russia is still the Soviet Union. Everyone is supposed to bow to their wants and whims. But at some level, he knew that the hand that he was playing wasn't as great as he had wanted it to be. That's when you start to see the development of what I like to call the axis of assholes. You have Russia and China, and they have a kind of good cop, bad cop routine in which China's the one to try and bribe their way into things, and Russia's the heavy who's bringing the muscle. So China can go in with big infrastructure loans and curry influence that way. Russia will send military support or mercenaries, and you see them doing this in Africa and in the Middle East, in places like Syria. Now, where Ukraine comes into this, I think in terms of being a crown jewel for the axis of assholes to control, is that many of these countries that Russia and China attempted to curry favor with in places like the Middle East and Africa, they need cheap food. And Ukraine is one of the largest food exporters in the world. This is in part why, of all the things going on in the war that Russia was actually willing to negotiate about, was to allow food exports from Ukraine. Of course, that itself can't avoid being a political football that people are fighting over. But nonetheless, Russia knows that would these exports stop completely, that would put their allies and the countries they attempt to court in Africa and the Middle East in serious jeopardy, possibly risk of famine and starvation in those countries. Even as it stands, there's massive inflation, in part because of the oil and gas problems, in part because of the food. So this war is hurting their allies. But I think from the perspective of Russia under Vladimir Putin, that what they believed they had was a combination of financial and resource leverage along with the threat of force. And that was the basis of their power. Whereas the basis of Western power is actually having economies that countries in Eastern Europe would want to integrate themselves with. Lots of people want German-made cars. No one wants a Russian-made car. Russians don't even want Russian-made cars. So given the hand that Russia had to play, that their power base and their ability to influence their neighbors was essentially economic blackmail, using the wealth that the oligarchical elite had amassed to spread influence and corruption through other countries, and the fact that Russia had a military they could potentially try and push people around with, that was pretty much the basis of their power. That's why I call them the axis of assholes, because they have nothing to offer but corruption and blackmail and the threat of force, and what stands behind them are authoritarian governments. Had taking over Ukraine been as fast and easy as Vladimir Putin convinced himself it was going to be, then Ukraine would have been a feather in the cap of the axis of assholes. That's more resources that they could use as leverage, and they would intimidate the rest of the world with their show of military force. But it did not work out that way. Having said all that, I want to backtrack a bit and go into more detail on parts of his comment. So he says, NATO does want to militarily encircle Russia and weaken its strategic position. And he goes on to say, there is a massive, indefensible border between Russia and Ukraine, and there is a history of European countries invading Russia. And this is what bugged me about this comment, aside from the fact that I've heard many of these talking points before, is because he begins the comment by saying, I haven't heard any credible person claim that NATO was planning on invading Russia, and in the next breath, explain that NATO was militarily encircling Russia, and talking about the indefensible border between Ukraine and Russia. Okay? Right. How do you square that circle? There is little sense to be made of this without implying a direct military threat. If we both agree that NATO was not going to invade Russia, then much of what he said becomes bullshit. In terms of its strategic position, that's true, but the problem with its strategic position is that can mean a lot of different things, some of which we can say, well, too bad for them. Of course, it's in Russia's strategic interest to dominate its neighbors. Given the disparity between what the European Union has to offer those neighbors and what Russia has to offer those neighbors, and what NATO has to offer those neighbors and Russia has to offer those neighbors, well, guess what? All of these former Soviet countries that joined with the European Union, joined with NATO, as I already said, that was what was in their self-interest. And even modern-day post-Soviet Russia doesn't have something better to offer them. Just like Mexico and Canada are not going to defect because what the United States has to offer them is a better deal and more in their self-interest. So, of course, it wasn't good for Russia, but tough shit for them. And as far as Vladimir Putin goes, he lays on the threat of NATO so thick that he might as well be explicitly stating that NATO was planning to attack Russia. So I want to read part of Putin's speech, and I will spare you all my fake Russian accent. But after Putin explains this encroachment of NATO, he then goes on to say, of course, this situation begs the question, what next? What are we to expect? If history is any guide, we know that in 1940 and early 1941, the Soviet Union went to great lengths to prevent war, or at least delay its outbreak. To this end, the USSR sought not to provoke the potential aggressor until the very end by refraining and postponing the most urgent and obvious preparations it had to make to defend itself from an imminent attack. When it finally acted, it was too late. Now, sidebar here, he of course ignores the pact that the Soviet Union had with Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union was actively supporting Nazi Germany until they were attacked by Germany. And they basically had signed a deal to divide up Poland between them, the poor, innocent Soviet Union. So anyway, he goes on to say, as a result, the country was not prepared to counter the invasion by Nazi Germany, which attacked our motherland on June 22, 1941, without declaring war. The country stopped the enemy and went on to defeat it, but this came at a tremendous cost. The attempt to appease the aggressor ahead of the Great Patriotic War proved to be a mistake, which came at a high cost to our people. In the first months after the hostilities broke out, we lost vast territories of strategic importance, as well as millions of lives. We will not make this mistake a second time. We have no right to do so. And then he goes on and on and on. So, you tell me, does invoking a, let's say, interestingly revisionist history of the beginnings of the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union and saying that they didn't act in time to prevent catastrophe or near catastrophe during that war, but we have to act in the context of invading Ukraine. And right after he explained about the encroachment of NATO, is he saying that NATO is going to attack us? Not explicitly. Is he laying it on so thick that anyone with an IQ above room temperature gets what he's implying? Yes. If you reject the idea that NATO was planning to invade Russia, then all of these arguments involving pseudo-sophisticated geopolitical analysis of Russia's interests collapse, and you're simply left with the reality that Russia launched a brutal and destructive invasion of its neighbor for self-serving reasons. And even where there are some legitimate causes of concern, like missile systems or anti-missile systems on a country's borders, this person's comment alluded to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two sides negotiated their way out of the situation with backroom deals, in which the United States withdrew its missiles from Turkey, which were going to be obsolete anyway, in exchange for Russia withdrawing its missiles from Cuba. It's interesting that we would talk about Russia's strategic position or weakening Russia, but if their only thing they could resort to was invading Ukraine in response to this hypothetical threat, that's actually the sign of a weak position, that they couldn't actually negotiate. And I would reiterate again that even if we humor this type of Russian pretext for the war, it was not the smart play in terms of strengthening its position. Russia has weakened itself strategically economically and militarily in ways that were both predictable and unpredictable as a result of this war. But I guess now they can say that the only people attacking their indefensible border with Ukraine are other Russians. I don't know, victory. But let's continue on with this comment. The commenter goes on to say, "It is prolonging the war at the expense of Ukrainian lives." Now look, I understand that, but here's the problem. Russia has shown no signs of wanting to negotiate. They want the West to give up and give them what they want. They believe they can hold out longer than us. Ukraine does not want to stop fighting. So withdrawing support may at some point, further down the line than these anti-war activist people would want, cause the war to be ended through negotiation. But it would be at the price of allowing Russia to strengthen its hand. Withdrawing our support only gives Russia a stronger hand to play at the negotiating table. And as I explained in detail in my last video, I think that's a mistake. The comment goes on to say, "If you think Russian victory is implausible, while the Ukrainian victory is plausible, you haven't been paying attention to what's actually happening in the conflict, and/or you've been listening to dishonest people." And I gotta say, I am so tired of this sort of, you believe the mainstream media because you're a sheeple, you can't accept the truth, blah. Get over yourself. I've heard this sort of nonsense from conspiracy theorists. Every asshole with a contrarian opinion thinks that the people on the other side have just been duped by propaganda. Like, get over yourself, buddy. But in all seriousness, but he goes on to say, Ukraine is not doing well. Russia isn't doing great either, especially with the currently unfolding apparent mutiny, but Russia can sustain higher attrition than Ukraine can. Now, first of all, I don't think that Ukraine is doing well in the sense of attrition. They're suffering enormously. It's not as if that the Ukrainian soldiers are all supermen with invincible Western weapons. I have no illusions about that. But to say that Russia can outlast them because it's a war of attrition assumes that it will stay a war of attrition. So let me be clear about what I think is the path forward. This is not entirely my own thought process. I'm drawing from a lot of different sources, and I'm not claiming to be some sort of strategic genius, but this is my understanding of a path towards Ukrainian victory. As it stands now, we're basically looking at World War I styles of fighting with trenches and defensive lines. However, if Ukraine is able to break through those defensive lines and make a push to cut off Russian supply lines, that would unhinge the Russian position and make their hold on the areas that they already have much more tenuous. And it would then not become a mere battle of attrition, but something closer to a battle of maneuver. In that scenario, you basically have the highly motivated, recently trained by NATO and equipped by NATO forces of Ukraine versus a Russian army that is undertrained, under-equipped, under-motivated. I'm not saying that Ukraine will succeed in breaking through their defensive lines and that their counteroffensive will be this glorious victory that will take back all of Ukraine in a week or something like that. However, strategically speaking, there are many ways in which it can shift to not being a war of attrition, and this, well, Russia just has more bodies to throw at the problem, doesn't necessarily hold true. The current state of the war is not in Ukraine's interest to continue the status quo. It all remains to be seen exactly how this will play out. But this idea that Russia just has more bodies to throw at the problem and therefore Russia will win is not only not true in a military sense, but again, it just goes back to this idea that I've been stressing, that whatever pretext Russia had, it was stupid to invade Ukraine. It has only backfired and hurt them. Some of this was predictable, some of it was unpredictable. But you have a country that is facing a demographic crisis in the imminent future, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of its soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of more people have, some of the best and brightest have fled the country. The actual cost of this attrition and brain drain is something that will severely harm Russia in the medium to long term. But hey, I guess NATO can't invade through Ukraine now, even though they've burned their future down. But that's my response to this comment. I basically think this person is trying to play Schrodinger's pretext, where NATO was both going to invade Russia and not going to invade Russia, and therefore Russia was justified or had a reason to invade Ukraine that wasn't self-defeating on numerous levels. I've heard the arguments made in this comment before from people like Vladimir Putin, from people like John Mearsheimer, and I don't think this person is a anti-war leftist type. They strike me more as, let's say, the contrarian type. You believe the mainstream narrative, you believe the mainstream media. Well, let me contradict that with the truth, i.e., a contrarian opinion. One of those people that confuses a contrarian opinion for the truth. I'm sorry, but they're not the same thing. So that's all for now. In a future episode, I want to talk about the problem of polarization in our society right along these lines of people adopting contrarian opinions out of some need to have contrarian opinions, but also this idea of credibility. Because again, the comment starts out saying, I haven't heard any credible person claim NATO was planning to invade Russia. And the word credible does a lot of work in that sentence, being the no true Scotsman fallacy. But I feel that part of the problem is that the average person in society has come to rely on this idea of credibility. And credibility is one of the easiest things to attack. So if you want to assess, say, what's happening in a war, it's very difficult, but you can look at things like images that confirm how many tanks have been destroyed. You can try and get past the government nonsense to find out how many casualties there have been. You can try and find actual statistics behind what either side is claiming. But that takes actual work. It's much easier to side with one team in the information war versus the other, and the members of the team attack each other saying, well, your side's not credible. That's not really how you get at the truth. Getting at the truth of things is much harder. Oftentimes it requires work that the average person doesn't want to do, expertise that the average person doesn't want to have, and that's why I think these things keep circling around to the issue of credibility and attacking credibility. But again, I want to elaborate that on a future episode, so hope you all stay tuned for that and have a good whatever time it is.